Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Reinvent the University for the Whole Person. My name is Randy Bass. I'm the Vice Provost for Education at Georgetown University. And Georgetown is partnering with a startup called Reinventors to bring you this series. This is the fourth episode in a 6-episode series, and today we're talking about the next metrics. We've been looking at the whole question of this rapidly changing landscape of higher education and how it bears on the question of reinventing the university while trying to imagine how we want to educate the whole person for the future. What does that future context look like? We started the series by establishing that the future, at the very least, is a rapidly changing environment where the kinds of skills and knowledge that you need will change all of the time. It's a context in which technology, artificial intelligence, computing power is going to continue to proliferate our world and saturate our world to the extent that it's really going to start to carve out the kinds of jobs that will be left to humans, the kinds of work that will be left to humans that will emphasize things like complex judgment, complex communication, non-routine tasks. And it's also a future context that is filled with complex problems like climate change, a context where there will be no simply technical problems, but all technical problems will be socio-technical problems. So for all these reasons, we feel that this is starting to build a compelling case for reinventing the university around the whole person. Someone who can adapt to change, someone who's able to negotiate change, who knows how to learn, who knows how to connect, who knows how to act, to network, to reflect. These are the kinds of skills that we've come to talk about are really crucial to the future of all students. And that's also been an important theme of this series, this question of equity, that reinventing the whole person is not just something that we want for a privileged few, and that the rest of America, the rest of higher education is really getting a different kind of education, but that this vision of education for the whole person is equitable, it's democratic, it's accessible to everyone. We want to reinvent the university for everyone around this vision of the whole person. So last week we took this sense of context, this sense of the kind of skill sets we want for all students, and we talked about the changing environment, the balance and the integration of the physical and the face-to-face. How we want to think about this shift, as we've been talking about it in the series, from education systems to learning systems. And one of the key consequences of that is realizing that the university is still a very unique institution, but it no longer has a monopoly on learning. And that shift of trying to imagine what is the uniqueness of the university, but in a ubiquitous learning system that is much larger than the university, that's become an important theme for us. And then we talked about how we could imagine environments that would then support students in learning how to collaborate, learning how to adapt, learning how to learn. Talked about the changing role of faculty to become cognitive coaches, and the importance of imagining collaboration and collaborative designs to foster exploration, inquiry, and play. So this week, we turn from thinking about how the environments need to change to really thinking about what are the next metrics. If we're going to take seriously in reinventing the university this question of the whole person, of this whole skill set, of these changing environments, then we have to get more systematic about how it is we talk about this full range of development. And that's what we mean today by the next metrics. We're not using metrics narrowly to mean simply psychometrics or testing, but metrics in the sense of assessing, of asking how it is that we can even know if students are learning in this full range of development, and also how can we know our impact? What is the impact of the university on student learning? What are those metrics? So to take up these questions today, we have a fantastic panel, and I'll introduce them now. Our anchor is George Koo, one of the leading figures in assessment. He's the director of NILOA, the National Institute for Learning Outcomes and Assessment, and Chancellor's Professor of Higher Education Emeritus at Indiana University. And of course, one of the founders and leaders of the National Survey of Student Engagement for many years. We also have with us Heather Hiles, who is the founder and CEO of Pathbrite. Ruth Deakin Crick, who is a reader in systems learning and leadership at the University of Bristol. Dan Hickey, who's associate professor in the learning sciences program at Indiana University. And also Nicole Boyer from Reinventors, who's a design specialist and co-host with me here. So welcome everybody, and welcome George. Thank you so much, George, for being willing to be our anchor and be with us. Let me ask you a couple of questions to get us started. You've spent a lot of time over the years trying to help higher education get better data about the degree to which they're helping their students become engaged, or engaged to engage in deep learning, integrative thinking. It raises a really important question that I think we want to start with here, which is what exactly is it can we know about learning related to the whole person? What is it that we do know? What is it that we can know?
Well, it's a pleasure, an honor to join you all, Randy, and thanks for that easy softball question to begin with. We've not spent, as an industry, a lot of time and attention on this notion of assessing the whole person. We do a much better job describing what we think we ought to be doing in catalogs, and far less in terms of the time and attention we devote to it. If you look across the inventory of existing assessment tools, and one of the kind of surprising things, though, well, surprising to some, maybe not to others, the number of tools that are available to assess what we call student learning has jumped from about 24 in the year 2000 to now more than 200. These are things that institutions, other organizations will buy off the shelf from for-profit and not-for-profit providers. But I dare say, the last time I looked, you're not going to find a tool that describes its purpose to assess whole purpose outcome. Now, when you broaden that to, as you have for this session, when you broaden that to include things like creativity, which is not a new concept, but it's something that's receiving far more attention because the business community is arguing that that's what they want, or at least some people representing that community of interest. One of the crosswhips we have here, though, is that the people who come to hire college graduates tend not to look for creative impulses. They look for a set of skills, proficiencies that can be used immediately on the job, even though everyone recognizes, and the purpose of this exchange is that we want more than that. We want people who can continue to learn, can continue to add to the skill proficiency set. We've learned a lot of things about engagement, as you say. That is the kind of animating impulses that encourage students to spend more time and energy on task. But the black box remains, how do you motivate the unmotivated? We can get students to perhaps achieve greater levels of accomplishment than they thought they could by pulling a number of best practices levers. But most of these levers tend not to focus on the, I'll use the term ineffable here, which has been coined by many people over the years. Those kinds of outcomes for which we do not have direct objective measures. So you mentioned the concept of deep learning, and I suspect, I'm confident that there are others on this panel who know more about this phenomenon than I do. But if by deep learning we're talking about the capacity, the demonstrated capacity to understand and then relate the underlying meaning of a concept or a construct, to take different pieces of information and create new insights and applications, to look at, find individuals finding patterns across disparate pieces of information, to take what they're learning and use it in these unscripted, increasingly complex situations, Randy, that you've mentioned. And then this additional characteristic of not just appreciating And by the way, we should come back to that word later, because appreciation, I think, has a lot to do with the nature of the dispositions that I think some of us are thinking about here. But appreciation is difficult to measure in the abstract. One has to be in a context to know whether it's being used in the right form. This last point, though, is that being able to see issues and concerns, not just appreciate them, but to be able to understand them deeply from the point of view of another. So I don't know, others on the panel may have, in fact, here some notions of how to assess in a so-called objective way. And I'm using that in the psychometric sense, Randy, that you eschewed us earlier from kind of avoiding. But depending upon what we hope the metrics will do. For example, one thing I hope we'll talk a little bit about is, do we want metrics that we can use to compare the performance of one individual to another? Do we want metrics where we can compare the overall performance of an institution to other institutions like it? Or do we want to create a rating system by which we can see whether some institutions are doing better at the work of helping whole persons develop? So we could not find, at least some years ago, could not find a so-called objective tool that ostensibly was measuring deep learning, these qualities that I began to take off. And so, as you know, maybe the others do too, what we did with Nessie was to come up with proxies, behaviors that we thought would represent the kind of the performance that people who had developed capacity for deep learning would be able to demonstrate. Well, I'm going off here on a tangent. Maybe I'll just stop here and see what else you'd like to try to respond to.
That's fantastic way to get us started. Thank you. And I'll give the rest of the panel an opportunity to weigh in here in a moment, but before we just, and actually those things that you raise about those questions of do we want to compare, do we want to compare institutions, we'll definitely come back to those at the end of the session. Let me just ask you this question before I ask you a question that will give it open to the whole panel. I'm just, in your opinion, if we talk about things like dispositions or mindsets, the kinds of things we haven't been good at measuring, whether it's creativity, curiosity, resilience, empathy, openness, etc. Do you think that it's important for us to figure out how to measure these in some sense, whether it's purely objectively or some combination of quantitative, qualitative? How important do you think it is for higher education to make progress on being able to measure those kinds of dispositions?
Well, is it essential to our future? I think it is. So the reason we're not very good at measuring it is we haven't invested a lot of time and energy and resources in trying to measure these things. Now, if some of these things are truly, well, they're not truly ineffable, but we can come up with estimates perhaps. But all of these matters really are, like most learning, context dependent, right? So should we get better at this? Yes. But we need, I think, a clearer set of first-order outcomes. You went through a list of the kinds of dispositions, perhaps, that might be on the radar screen of some organizations, some groups. There's no sense, at least that I can get, that the business community, for example, just using that huge population of stakeholders, which at the moment is really driving most conversations about accountability and even improvement in terms of what we call the assessment regime. And we've now alienated many of our faculty colleagues to think about their role in documenting student performance, because they either are choosing to leave it up to this set of external vendors to come up with a tool, and they look askance at those because they know most of those tools don't really tap what it is they're trying to do in their own classrooms. And so I think we have we have two groups of people we really need to attend to. One is this large group of external people, who most of whom I think are, at least in my mind, are employers, to what extent are they really interested in these kinds of outcomes? And then we have the faculty at large, who, for the most part, will also not see many of these out. We don't offer a degree in whole person development, right? I mean, there are some places that are looking to creating degrees in entrepreneurial activity and so forth and so on. That's about as close as well. And of course, seminaries have their own set of outcomes that are congenial with the list that you've come up with. But one of our big challenges is the academy does not take these outcomes particularly seriously, right? So we tend not to offer courses in them. We certainly don't offer degrees in them. And what we need, I was going to, start with a couple of aphorisms. I'll just throw them out now. And you began with one, a third one, which was, you're going to, you better choose wisely what you want to measure, because you'll end up valuing the things that you can measure. That's in essence what we've been doing. But the other two are, if you don't know where you want to go, any road will take you there. Of course, we come up with a bunch of other Yogi Berra kinds of views toward the world. But we need to be more precise about what we mean. And without that precision, we're not going to get very far down the road in terms of what we would like to be able to do with regard to these disposition and skills. And I've happily forgotten the other aphorism I wanted to share. So maybe I'll throw it in later, probably not.
Great, thank you. I'll try to tee you up for that. Let me just ask you a quick question, then we'll throw it to the rest of the panel, and maybe you're starting to get at it there, or maybe you have a different one. I want to just get the whole panel, you and the whole panel, to kind of set the problem context here, or to continue to set the problem context as you've been doing. What would you consider to be then for you the crossroads issue? This is kind of the crossroads question. What for you is the critical juncture that we're at right now around, if we're in a kind of crisis around higher education, or at least a period of rapid change, and you think just about the question of measurement and assessment, what for you is the kind of critical crossroads issue?
Well, there are at least two that come to mind. I've already mentioned one, and I don't want to dwell on it, but I don't think there's enough general agreement on what it is we want to have colleges and universities have their students be able to do and accomplish. 85% of universities now claim to have an endorsed set of desired outcomes for all their students, but we know also that most curricula are not mapped to produce those outcomes. And so we are still in a period where faculty are, in a sense, individual entrepreneurs dealing with courses, and too often even programs, where the courses themselves don't hang together to produce the outcomes we're after. Now, this is not just about the ineffable that we've been talking a little bit about, but the so-called core, the knowledge systems and the analytical reasoning and quantitative abilities that we claim students ought to know. A lot of programs don't add up to the outcomes we're after. So we have this issue, this gap between what institutions claim their students ought to be able to know and do, and what then, at the end of the day, student performance demonstrates. But we also have an issue on the measurement tool side, Randy, as everybody on this panel well knows. Most of the tools we have, almost all of them, are not designed for this set of outcomes. And so we're in a period of, I think, rapid experimentation. That's the good news, where more and more work is being done on efforts to measure authentic student learning. We're going to hear later from Dan, for example, on badges and so forth and so on. But how do you go then from discrete sets of behaviors that are determined by an individual person, but not necessarily affirmed or endorsed or authenticated by a larger body of experts saying, yes, that particular performance, that behavior is what we mean by creativity or whatever the outcome may be. The last point I'll make here is we've got alternative credentialing frameworks that are on the horizon. So when we talk about, you and your colleagues have used the term informal learning in previous sessions. so this is not just on the experiential side of the ledger, where students moving through a program will do an internship or study abroad or something, but it's also this host of learning gains, skills, proficiencies that come from the workplace, from family life, from church and engagement with community experiences and so on. So there's a wide swath here. We don't have agreement on what we're after, and we surely don't have the tools yet to adequately measure what we think we want.
Terrific. Thank you. So would someone here on the panel like to jump in? We'll get to everyone, but who'd like to weigh in first on what's your crossroads issue? What do you think is the critical gap? Picking up on one of the ones that George mentioned, or going on something else?
I can jump in. As you know, but perhaps others don't, I'm the CEO of a new generation of an e-portfolio product. And Pathbrite is what we call a portfolio learning platform. For me, one of the crossroads issues is that we believe firmly that individuals should be in possession and ownership of their own learning experience and trajectory. They should be able to self-assess. Here's what I need to know in order to be ready for this work opportunity, this job, this career, this other opportunity. Here's what I know today, and here's what I need to gain in terms of skills, knowledge, experience to be prepared. And so when we launched Pathbrite, it was for the purpose of empowering individuals to be in ownership of their own learning process, to be in ownership of all the evidence of what they're learning, but to be able to showcase and self-assess or showcase to others what they've achieved and what they've mastered. I also really agree with what George was saying about there's, I think, a real need for translation and communication between what formal education institutions are generating in terms of learning outcomes, in terms of an education for people, and connecting that with the real needs of the workforce and of employers. I absolutely am convinced. I've done a lot of workforce development in my life, and employers are absolutely looking for threshold kinds of capabilities which only allow for you to get your foot in the door for an interview, but then they're looking for these qualitative kinds of capabilities which we think of as 21st century skills to be able to really to land the job, to get hired. And those kind of attributes include, communication, creativity, curiosity, common sense, integrity. Those are the things that all employers are seeking out in any kind of employee. And they can find the evidence of those properties, those attributes, through the higher ed experiences of the students, but they're not communicated or conveyed in any way that an employer can actually decipher. And a transcript and a resume really doesn't do much in the way of helping communicate those competencies and those characteristics. So I think that those two are really crossroads issues. The individual being able to self-assess and improve their own metacognition and meta-learning, and also for there to be better translation between formal education and informal education as with the world of work.
Yeah, shall I follow on from that? I think I want to say the same thing differently. I think a real crossroads issue for us, certainly in higher education, is how we create learning design that delivers the intellectual rigor and quality that we have come to expect from many of our higher education institutions, whilst at the same time paying as much attention and integrating the personal qualities and dispositions and attitudes that individuals need to engage with complexity in the real world when they leave universities and enter, say, engineering or medicine. And the Royal Academy of Engineering in the UK has just literally this month commissioned a report that has just been published called Thinking Like an Engineer. And they're basically addressing this question because they recognise that it's no good just producing engineers who know a lot. They need to produce engineers who are able to think holistically, to understand that engineering systems and technical systems are embedded in human systems. And if they're going to build a complex technical system well, they've got to be able to understand how humans will interact with it. And so therefore a wider range of competencies are required to be embedded into their education. And actually the report that they've published has got a model with presence of mind at the heart of it, which is quite interesting, habits of mind, and frames of thinking. So, but I think the real challenge is how to integrate things that we've typically held separately in our sort of worldview, i.e. intellectual rigour in a particular domain that we can measure objectively, inverted commas, with the personal qualities that we need to make use of that knowledge and co-generate new knowledge in the real world.
Excellent. We'll come back to that point, I think, in a minute. Dan, what's your crossroads issue?
Well, I'm trained to measure stuff, and I did my postdoctoral training at Educational Testing Service. I'm more skeptical than most of my assessment colleagues about whether or not these things that we care about, Laurie Shepard once called them 21st century blah, blah, blah. We're all talking about it. I think that the challenges that George discussed earlier, I actually disagree with him respectfully. I don't think we can measure that stuff. I think we need to give up, in key respects, this idea that that these things can be removed from context in a way that lends themselves well to conventional psychometric notions. I like Ruth's notion of dispositions. I go a few steps further and embrace Melissa Grisolfi and Jim Greeno's characterization of dispositions. And it's my assumption is that we can assess dispositions. We can assess whether or not people choose to act in desirable ways in particular disciplinary contexts. We can assess it and get at a little bit of it, but we really can't measure it and still have anything particularly meaningful. I still believe in doing good assessment and good measurement, but I think that the move towards portfolios, the move towards digital badges have a lot of potential. I think Ruth's learning analytics work looks extremely intriguing. I'm really looking forward to seeing where that goes. So, but yeah, again, it's partly my theoretical orientation is much more towards specifically situated theories of learning. That really has focused much of my career in thinking very, very differently about assessment and the tensions between summative and formative functions of assessment. And particularly, I like the notion of transformative and even transcendent assessment. I think the technology in particular is causing very rapid changes in the way that evidence and information circulates in social networks that's allowing some and forcing others in short order to transcend traditional notions of measurement and assessment and things like motivation.
So would that be your sort of crossroads issue then, is that we need to actually be focused much more on situated assessment?
Yes. Yeah, and I think probably the most useful trajectory in my work anyways is a very strong focus on disciplinary engagement and looking to see that people are engaging in meaningful ways in discourse that defines the various disciplines which we're attempting to enculturate them into. That for me is the crossroads issue, is how do we interpret that? Can we assess that? But most importantly, I think that what I'd like to see is the kinds of measures that people like George work with, look for ways of connecting those things that we can confidently measure to people's engagement with disciplinary knowledge in their academic training, and seeing whether there's what I would call an echo. Rather than looking for those things directly, what I do in my work is look and see whether there's an echo from interpretive measures. Those should echo on assessments, and things that show up on assessments should show echoes on measures. So you're looking for these traces across increasingly formal assessment practices.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yes, and I don't think that there's any reason that we need to We talk about the dispositions because they're the 21st century blah, 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 as you so felicitously called them, that quoted. I don't think we have to necessarily think about them to measure them separately. I think we're talking about them because they've been the invisible piece, but I think ultimately trying to find ways to look at them in an integrated way with skills, abilities, knowledge is, as you say, probably the only reasonable way that we can eventually integrate them into our practices. Ruth, I wondered if, since you've given a lot of thought, and Dan teed you up here, your work has really been trying to find if there's ways to at least measure or to some extent quantify some of the things that really are captured around, let's say, learning how to learn. And you co-wrote a book that just came out in the last few days called Learning How to Learn. I'll just read one quotation that came off the Learning Emergence blog about your book. Learning how to learn is a crucial competence for human flourishing under the 21st century conditions of risk and uncertainty. As an outcome, learning how to learn, it is a competence we aspire to measure and celebrate. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit for a few minutes about how your work has looked to both measure and celebrate learning how to learn, or learning power, as you call it.
Okay, thanks. Well, we first decided to try to develop an assessment strategy to measure learning dispositions because of the over-focus on summative testing and assessment that we were plagued with in the UK. This was 15 years ago. So we deliberately set out to say that if we could identify the qualities that make people good at learning, then perhaps we could find ways of measuring them and devising assessment tools that enable people to get better at learning rather than simply to pass the test. And so we did a fairly sort of standard approach to developing an assessment tool, which was to, seek to identify these qualities, and came up with 7 dimensions that have proved stable in psychometric terms over time. And those 7 dimensions are changing in learning, which is the sort of hope and optimism I have about being able to engage with uncertainty and challenge. Meaning making, which is about making sense of data and connecting it to my story. Creativity, which is about using intuition and imagination, risk-taking and playfulness. Learning relationships, which is the quality of being able to learn with and from other people rather than always working on my own or being isolated. Strategic awareness, which is about the ability to step back and reflect on what I'm doing, to be able to manage the feelings of learning as well as thinking about metacognition and the processes of learning, so just managing the whole processes of learning. And curiosity, which is about getting beneath the surface, challenging, asking questions, and not just simply taking things at face value. I think I might have left one out, which is resilience, the tendency to generally persevere with a challenge and be task-orientated rather than performance-oriented. And having identified these scales, the task was a very practical one, which was to devise a measurement tool that would stimulate change and be actually useful in practice, which is, I think, where we departed from the more traditional ways of developing psychometrics. And that was where we came up with this spider diagram, which we've used ever since as the primary feedback to users when they answer a self-report questionnaire about themselves in terms of their learning dispositions. And it raises that the purpose of the assessment is not to measure something in the traditional sense, but to measure something in order to stimulate change and to hand over responsibility for that change to the user. So it raises questions about the purpose of assessment and who has the authority to assess, and how objective is this assessment, and so on. And basically the measurement model of the spider diagram provides a framework for a coaching conversation. between the individual who's done the profile and a learning coach or facilitator talking about myself as a learner. And the conversation goes two ways, or can go two ways. It can sort of look inwards towards, am I like this? Is this really a reflection of me? Why am I like this? How do I want to change, or do I want to change, or am I happy to be like this? Some people look at their profiles and think, well, I'm really happy to be like this and I'm not going to change. But the conversation can also look forwards to, okay, how am I going to pursue a knowledge strategy or achieve a particular purpose or solve a problem using these dispositions? And so really it's a practical tool that uses measurements which are reliable and valid in the terms of scales and traditional psychometrics to stimulate change and to stimulate ownership. And so it raises all sorts of issues about who has the authority to assess what. Because if I'm talking about my identity, for example, or my purpose, maybe I have more authority to validate that than you do. However, if I'm doing something, say, a mathematics exam or something in the public domain, then the community of mathematicians or medics or engineers have the authority to assess that those outcomes. So, so that's the sort of the key ideas behind learning power. And basically, the assessment tool is useful in terms of stimulating change and providing a different language which is rooted in social science research but is flexible to interpretation by the individual.
Great. Thank you. And it's a very powerful tool, at least to start to bridge some of these binaries between what it is that we can measure and what it is that seems soft or ineffable or amorphous. And the way that you've used it, you can get quantitative data out of it and do comparative work. But it also becomes then an object of communication between students and mentors in the way that Heather talked about, how individuals should be in possession of their own learning paths, that it really is meant to empower learners, which I think is one of the objectives of assessment.
Yeah, and yeah, we sort of discovered it by, it was one of these unintended outcomes actually. We produced this learning analytic because we could, and then we realized that this one measurement that we took, we were able to use in feedback to the individual with a spider diagram with no numbers on. The same data and technology allows us to feed it back immediately in aggregate form to, say, a teacher or a group facilitator, so they can get information about a group, which is diagnostic. The organisation can use the same data to examine what's going on in terms of student learning dispositions across the piece, like they might want to examine a particular cohort. Why do we have underachieving boys in X year group, for example, from a school's example? And then over the years, we've collected a very large data set, or 70,000 plus cases that we can examine at a systems level. So I think that's one of the affordances of the changing technologies that we're sort of living with, that the same data point can be used in many different ways.
Ruth, I have a question for you. I should have added one of a real linchpin idea for me is the point that Heather raised about ownership over data and control over data. So what you're presenting is a very different kind of data than what Heather would offer, and so I wonder, how much ownership does someone feel? I mean, that's what I worry about with learning analytics, is how much of my work in learning analytics is really what I'm calling participatory learning analytics, where I'm really trying to show people that they're much more than a data point, and that they it's a huge challenge. Like, how that spider diagram, just do people see themselves in it? Do they identify with the way they're being represented in that fashion? And how do you address that?
What we basically say to users when we're working with these spider diagrams is, actually, you have the authority to say whether you accept this diagram or not. Essentially, it's what they're saying about themselves. So if the trust and the culture is right, then basically the individual is producing data in order to own it and use it to stimulate change. And that is a very particular way of using learning analytics that is rooted in the concept of self-organisation and authority to assess resting with the individual. And of course it can be abused, which is why in terms of the social enterprise work based on these LE assessments, we've maintained, insofar as we can, a sort of quality assurance, because you could, of course, use it very negatively to, destroy somebody, or use it very insensitively. So there's an ethics around it, and it is about ownership of data. And I think it is paradigmatically different from an authoritarian culture where experts have the right to measure and judge, because it's actually part of a more empowering culture where we are saying, actually, if somebody's going to learn, they've got to understand their own purpose. They've got to be passionate about something. They've got to find an identity and determine their own purpose. And if we can't enable our young people to do that, then we're not going to get deep transformational learning, because they're simply being done to by external conditions. So there's a paradigmatic shift, I think, that we're actually in the middle of, that is really important that you've put your finger on. And it is to do with who has the authority to assess, what are we using the measurements for. It's about internal control versus external control. And how do we balance these complex ways of understanding what is true, these different rationalities, in a way that does justice to what it means to be a human and a human in community.
That's probably a great transition then to asking the question about this major shift of authority and empowerment, of what we're measuring for, and the way that the technological environment, participatory environment, is actually creating this big potential shift of power of who owns assessment and who's assessing whom. Let me turn to Dan then, who has done a lot of work with the digital badging movement. To talk a little bit about badging, you said on your blog, Dan, that badges have the tremendous potential to transform the way that learning is recognized and assessed, just as we were talking about. And because recognition and assessment are so fundamental to education, which answers the question, why are we trying to measure? Recognition and assessment are so fundamental to education, open badges have the potential to transform learning as we know it. So can you just give us a few minutes here? What is digital badging, and how might they transform learning as we know it?
Sure. Thanks, Randy. Well, digital badges emerged really around 2010. They were central to the MacArthur Foundation's Digital Media and Learning Initiative. Connie Yowell, who's the director of the DML initiative, they were about 4 years in, and really had built this really remarkable community of people who were doing quite amazing things in sort of semi-formal and informal learning spaces, in libraries. Nicole Pinkert and others were just doing tremendous stuff, especially with youth and inner city youth. And all of this learning was happening, and no one could really see it. No one could really recognize it because it was outside of the existing credentialing system. So, you could give kids certificates and stuff, but it didn't really mean very much. And so Philip Schmidt and others, Aaron Knight, were at Peer-to-Peer University, where they were building that, and that's where the core ideas of open digital badges emerged around 2010. MacArthur really picked up with it with the competition in 2011 that was announced in 2011. So in 2012, 30 projects were awarded grants to develop open digital badges. Mozilla was given funds to develop the so-called OBI, the Open Badge Infrastructure, that makes the whole thing possible, and to develop the digital backpacks that allow people to accumulate and control and display and annotate whatever evidence of their accomplishments in a way that they wish to show them. So I'm just wrapping up a 2-year study of those 30 badge awardees, which only really included a handful of higher ed institutions. And I'm now shifting gears. I'll be focusing on bringing digital badges into the edX platforms, the Google Course Builder platforms, and really trying to expand the use of digital badges, and especially to promote the sort of visionary use of digital badges that we saw in some, but not all of our projects. One of the things that people don't realize about digital badges is really all they are in the end is an image and 8 bits of metadata. And what you put in those metadata fields is entirely up to the issuer. So the important thing about digital badges is that they can contain specific claims and evidence and links to more evidence to support those claims, and they are intended to circulate in social networks. When you earn a badge in my course, one click and it's on Facebook, one more click it's on Twitter, one more click it's in an email going to someone who can look at it. So let me ground this by actually showing you what one looks like. So I received a grant from Google in 2013 to develop what I call a BOOC, a big open online course. So I took my online educational assessment class and I scaled it up. I opened it up to 500 people, and I used this technology that I call a Wikifolio. They're public, sort of persistent artifacts that everyone in the class can see, and then issued open badges. So when you complete, if you finish my class and you earn 3 a badge for assessment practices, principles, and policies, and you get a satisfactory score on the final exam, you earn this badge. And this is one of my students, Marina Michael, who took it for free. I had 4 credit students in the course as well, but out of the 160 students who ended up enrolling and participating, so she elected to send her badge out to her Mozilla backpack, where she was able to add additional information to it. And this is what is the public-facing thing. This is in her backpack. She's added information about it. I assume everybody can see it. Is that visible? So when you click on the badge itself, it takes you to my server where I maintain this information. This is the information that I chose to put in this badge. I decided that I would say this about this person, that this was the criteria. So you can see this is all information that my team discussed, and this is the really important thing about digital badges that I think a lot of people are just beginning to appreciate, is that the act of determining what information you're going to put in a badge it's disruptive at minimum. It's catastrophic for some. Some organizations, it's remarkably difficult for them to actually make specific claims about what people are going to learn because they've never really done it before. But what it really is it's transformative, the discussions that people have around it. So you see this criteria. Now what we've elected to do is, let me reshape that. So what you can see here are the 3 badges that Marina had to earn the expert badge. And what you see there is the badge on the right says leader on it, unlike the other ones. And so if you want to see what that is, that's simply another badge. We can click on that badge, and what you see here is the explanation right there. While engaging in this activity, the Wikifolio created by the awardee were marked as exemplary more often than any other individuals in their peer professional networking group. And this is really key. Right here is the work that she did. So I'm going to click on the link to the Wikifolio that Marina completed. We can see here that 4 of her peers endorsed it as being complete. 2 of her peers promoted it as being exemplary. Here you see below, on the unit on evaluation of instruction, you can see that 5 of her peers endorsed it as being exemplary. Let's look at what that is. We click on it. We're going to the work that she completed. And what you see here is the actual text that her peers put when they mashed the button that said, I promote, you're only allowed to promote one as being exemplary. This is what they actually said about this work. And this is the work that she completed. So there you see that we have open educational resources that they're drawing in. There's this key feature in my Wikifolios whereby students simply rearrange these boxes to rank them from their own personalized perspective. Which of these complex concepts is most relevant to you and why? And that's what she was awarded exemplaries for her peers, was not for doing the best work, but for doing the best example of disciplinary engagement, of engaging with the topic of assessment in a way that made sense to her. She's an elementary school teacher in Cyprus. She really did a good job of contrasting how the policies were different and similar in Cyprus and really bringing to life. So those badges really are more than just a certificate. They're more than just a mark. They're really meant, this information is meant to circulate in social networks. So this goes back to the question that George raised earlier. So I'm going to let him go ahead and ask that question again, and you can probably imagine my response.
I think the question that Dan is referring to is who authenticates or certifies the proficiencies that the badge is intended to represent. Did I get that right, Dan?
Yep. And that's the issue that's been around since the very beginning with badges. I'm really excited to be working with the new Badge Alliance. Aaron Knight and Carla Casilli, the brain trust at Mozilla, who is responsible for much of this work, have left Mozilla. They're at a separate organization that is called Badge Alliance, and it has a number of working groups dedicated. There's one working group in higher education that I hope people will consider joining, and there's another one on this very issue of endorsements and who endorses it. There's a number of private firms like a credit trust that are trying to develop a what they claim will be the VeriSign. They want to be the VeriSign. What VeriSign did for digital purchases, they want to do it for digital badges. The community, though, right now is trying to leave it open. They were quite intentional about that. They knew that locking it down from the beginning would not allow this tremendous ecosystem to emerge around the digital badges. And also, so my question to you, George, is what I had to do there to put this information in those digital badges that makes it possible and probable that someone will share that information out over a social network. I have many students in my current book who learned about it because they viewed a badge on one of their peers' social networks, and they entered their email address at the bottom of it that said for more information. So that's a completely different model of recognizing learning than anything we've seen before. So right now the community is going to leave it open and see what solutions emerge, whether those are third party, whether they're more formal. I have a lot of opinions myself, but I think the most important one is if you're putting this kind of information out there, do we really need? It's more important that the information be there than the endorsement, right? I think it's the information in Marina's badge is more important than the fact that she earned it at Indiana University.
Well, purpose, to my mind anyway, purpose and use ought to drive our thinking about things like alternative credentialing systems. So your use of, by the way, I find all this fascinating. I'm just like the learner needs to be ready to learn. I didn't know anything about this discussion forum, by the way, Randy, until you emailed me. And even if I saw it come across my screen without a specific request to participate, I probably wouldn't have. Right. So I needed to be not just aware of this, but I needed to be able to think about how this experience was going to affect my own work and how I might integrate it with other things that I do, and then how I might apply and transfer it. And I've got plenty of ideas right now. But back to you, Dan. It is one thing, and I think a very important thing. I'm not disagreeing with anything that you said, nor do I think we're very far apart, by the way, on your earlier comment. What I tried to say earlier is I think higher ed ought to try to do better by measuring these kinds of dispositions. But we have, and I think I did say, we don't have the tools for it now. Whether we ever get there, I don't know. But we need to try. And you are doing that very thing with badges, right? It's the background to the badges that really matter to me, and I think matter to the learner. But it's one thing for learners to use this for their own purposes and for encouraging and motivating and continued learning. It's another thing for an external group to say, I'm accepting this badge as evidence that this person actually can do this stuff. I mean, who's going to go into the back stuff, right, Dan? I mean, what they want to see the badge, and they want to know that some external group has verified, certified that this person actually can do what that badge says. Having the back stuff is very important for the user, the individual person. So I don't know as much as I would like to know about this alternative certificate or credentialing framework that people are taught. Lumina, for example, Dan, maybe you all know about this. They've been very quiet about this, but they are convening people who are working across different sectors with badges and certifications and certificates, because it is the Wild West right now, right? It's a noble experiment to leave it wide open for a while, because you don't want to cut innovation off before it gets enough support to come to a fuller flowering, right? But sooner or later, there has to be some umbrella, if it's not an organization, a set of organizations that can certify and endorse the legitimacy of the badge or whatever the other certification emblem might be.
Yeah, I want to pitch it to some of the others in here what they think about it. Especially, I'm curious what Heather's thoughts are about it. But I was really impressed at the beginning of this when I read a piece by Carla Casilli, one of her blog posts, where she talked about credibility, and I kind of like, well, you know, credibility, it's like face validity. It's sort of an unsanctioned form of validity. But the more I thought about it, and it took me a few weeks of pondering, Carla convinced me and quite a few others that the way credibility is constructed in the internet, PJ Fogg is a researcher at Stanford who's done some very good work in this regard, that the way that credibility of information is constructed in the internet is probably going to have a lot more impact on the credibility of credentials than it ever did before. And that's going to be the game changer, because, so take for instance my class. So Marina earned that leader badge for her exemplary engagement. Now, those badges are rare. They're very hard to come by. Marina had to rearrange her teaching schedule to get her posts up early because she wanted to earn it. She really, really wanted it. And now, if there was some shenanigans going on, and somebody pranked our system and maybe traded promotions between each other or something, somehow the credibility of that badge as an example of leadership in the course could disappear in an instant if information began circulating in the social network of my class indicating that there was some shenanigans taking place. And so that is going to happen much, much more over the next few years than any of us can imagine. Now, whether or not we're going to ever have formal credentials behind badges, I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure that that organizations are going to find a way to truly verify these badges and have an independent verification system. But it's actually this co-curricular learning outcomes, or these soft outcomes, and most importantly, the synergy between these more 21st century dispositions that we're after. So, you know, you can earn a grade in my class, you can pay $1,400 tuition and do all of the required parts of each assignment, and I or my TA will go in and verify that you did it. But we found that the participation of students taking for the grade was almost indistinguishable from the students who were taking it not for credit and for the badge. Many of them were taking it because they want to get professional growth points from their schools. They can send that badge to their principal and say, I know the certificate says 30 hours, but I actually worked 50 hours, and here's the proof that I did that. So that's a very, very different way of thinking about this. So I'm going to stop now and hear what the others have to think about this.
Great. And you know, thank you, Dan. And you tossed it to Heather. Let's bring Heather in here, because you've been thinking a lot about, I mean, part of what, you know, we started by George saying that the kinds of things we wanted to measure were deeply contextual, and badges are themselves very contextual, deeply contextual, as this conversation exchange has really demonstrated. Let me bring Heather in, because you've been very interested in the combination of how portfolios as an environment can engage kind of the analytics around holistic learning, as well as all the work products that people produce. So you want to weigh in, Heather, on how learners can control their own learning context here?
Sure, I'm happy to. This is a very enjoyable discussion. I really appreciate being part of it. What I will say, taking a couple steps back, I've been working in the education and workforce development arenas for the past 25 years, but only learned about e-portfolio technology, say, about 5 years ago. And one of the reasons that I became so intrigued with them was, first, there were great longitudinal studies of the fact that people who were documenting and reflecting on what they were learning had improved critical thinking skills, improved metacognition, improved learning proficiencies, improved writing proficiencies. And if you distill down, an e-portfolio, the reason that I think that comes to fruition, that there's so many great results, is that we all as human beings have the need to continuously tell our story. And so I decided I wanted to build the first true cutting-edge, modern-day portfolio experience that did have the ability for people to have a kind of a living credential, if you will, but one curated by the self, one where you could continuously tell your story about what you were learning, achieving. And I will tell you that my bias is that the credential of the future is actually your work product. We are continuously and prolifically learning and creating, and we need to have a living place to show this body of work that continues to evolve and grow throughout our careers. And so that's what Pathbrite is meant to be, and naturally, then we need to be able to pull in artifacts ranging from essays and work product in formal education and online, but also transcripts and other kinds of artifacts, basically in badges, any kind of digital evidence of what we've created or achieved or learned, to be able to tell holistic stories. It is so much more telling for an admissions officer to review the badges and the curated story about the badges my son earned as an Eagle Scout than it is to read that as a kind of a bullet as a typical achievement. The curation and the storytelling around our credentials and what they meant to us give it so much more dimension. One example I give is that you may look at my transcript from business school, and you may see that I earned a B in microeconomics. So you may walk away thinking, well, Heather was a little bit weak in microeconomics. Maybe maybe it's just not her strong suit. But if you read the reflection around that artifact in my portfolio, you would read that I didn't have calculus going into that class. And prior to Khan Academy and all these great online resources, I had to learn calculus on the side just to pass the class. And so I'm very proud of my weakest grade, my poorest grade in business school. But those are the kinds of stories that one can tell by putting together whole pieces of a point in time with reflections. So another example is that we're, I think, increasingly the millennial generation of workforce and learners and even the world of work in today's generation. We're all viewed as freelancers who are constantly learning just in time to be able to deliver new work product. And so I hired a guy directly out of undergraduate from USF. He studied marketing and economics. I asked him to look at different kinds of pricing models for our company. So he took an edX course in pricing to be able to deliver and to make sure his mind was attuned to different kinds of my pricing model alternatives. So he went and just assumed he needed to learn a new set of skills and new information to be able to deliver in the workplace. So rather than my just seeing that he took an edX course, understanding that he did it to deliver something for Pathbrite, And seeing then the pricing model he came up with tells a much better story. And that's the kind of subconscious achievement and learning that we try to help people tease out and make conscious, and then also be able to showcase and tell to other communities. I was just going to show, just briefly, if it's okay, what a portfolio looks like from our perspective. Okay.
Sure.
Okay, great. Can you all see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so what I've done is I've logged into my own Pathbrite account. And here is where, again, what I am able to do as an individual is to have a private account where I can curate different kinds of portfolios to tell different stories. And the majority of my portfolios are actually for my eyes only, but allow for me to firm up and make conscious what I'm learning. And so I have a vision board, for example, that I don't share with anybody, but it's for my eyes to be able to track my own progress and my visions, my future destiny. But here's a professional portfolio that I make searchable, and to Daniel's point, this is one where I can share this portfolio to my LinkedIn account, to my Facebook account, tweet it out, email it to someone, and it is completely, I can make it completely searchable. But here I have a context for my professional experience. This is my background. And then I get to show different kinds of artifacts, ranging from my CV to a connection to different articles on different websites, to video clips, to different photos, any kind of digital evidence that tells the story of my journey and what my experience has been like. And I can have badges as different kinds of evidence. I earned this EdTech Entrepreneur of the Year award. I can tell different stories to different people, and this we believe is a very visual way of my being able to showcase the evidence of what the artifacts of what I've created, and I do believe that showing what you know and showing mastery of what you've created provides for a kind of level of verification and validation. When you have so many different kinds of evidence, it starts to, the different kinds of data points start to support one another about what you've created, what you've learned, and your progress. The artifacts also can have my description and a title and a description of what this artifact means to me. I can also pull in different kinds of recommendations and different kinds of secure documents, like official signed transcripts by different universities. And so I have this kind of combination of different kinds of content that all work together to tell a whole story, and I can also categorize them. So in this particular portfolio, I've categorized them by press coverage, leadership experiences, personal experiences, and policy papers I've written, so that you can kind of get a sense of how I categorize my kinds of experiences. But if you think about this kind of these kinds of data, just in my putting a story, telling a story with one portfolio, I've got the artifact level of data, title, a reflection on what it means to me, and then I've got comments and feedback from other people. And so there are many different layers of data all working together, verified and qualitative from me, all in one place. We also have a course environment where you can teach courses by generating templates of portfolios. And there an instructor can give examples. They can give an assignment, consume this reading or this video clip, and then they can give exemplars of, this is the kind of response and submission I'm looking for from you. And in the back of a template, you can tag it to say it fulfills these rubrics, these learning outcomes, these management objectives, these common core standards, whatever kind of measurement system you might have to offer. And then again, as people were saying earlier, the same kinds of content and data can be used many different ways for many different levels of evaluation. And so that's, for us, that's the kind of way that we look to make meaning. And yeah, and I think that this is a kind of, one other thing I was going to say is that some institutions talk to us about building co-curricular transcripts. And for me, another transcript is a snapshot in time, but it doesn't stay active and evolving. And for me, portfolios can be updated and curated for different audiences real time every day, and so they continue to stay alive.
Great, thank you. And you need to make sure you switch back to your screen of your picture.
Yeah.
So let's, I think it's interesting that as you were doing the demo of the site and talking about the different kinds of artifacts that you can curate, one of the very last things you showed us was a transcript.
Yeah.
And, I think that really raises the question I'd like to pose to the group to kind of bring us home for the last 15 minutes here or so, really, which is this question. How then disruptive are the kinds of things that we've been talking about? We're talking about broad set of learning analytics. We're talking about emerging ways to capture dispositions. Talking about badging, which can be done in a course, but really has nothing to do with a course or even whole degrees. We talk about portfolios that are really gathering all of your work products across. The focus of this series is really reinventing the university, trying to ask what is it that universities will be uniquely for in a broad learning system that is quite ubiquitous, bridging formal and informal learning. Are the kinds of things we're talking about a fantastic opportunity for universities to deepen what universities have always been for, or are they ultimately disruptive of the role that universities can play around measurement, assessment, certification? I think it'd be great if we could talk about this on our last 15 minutes out. Are these disruptive or a fantastic opportunity? Ruth, would you like to start with that?
Yeah, well, I think they're both disruptive and fantastic opportunities. And the really big challenge that I see through all of these different technologies is that we actually need we need a new breed of learning professional if we're going to support and professionally and rigorously enable people to navigate journeys that we've just been seeing. For example, the whole notion of learning as narration, or narrating my story through a portfolio, requires a very different type of facilitation from the traditional expert. And our traditional universities are much more full of experts who are used to expanding their knowledge and much less comfortable to understand that purpose really matters, that how one narrates their story through the curriculum is actually part of their formation as a person. So I think it's really challenging for us as learning professionals in HE, and I think it's disruptive because it challenges the existing power structures. So I think it's both.
Other thoughts?
So I'll chime in. So I really loved Heather's portfolio. It was interesting that she posted her transcript. I confess that when I wanted to learn more about her work and knew I was going to be speaking with her, I Googled her. That was what came up as the first hit. The first thing I noticed was that her degree was from Yale. And that's really interesting. I don't think that's going to go away. The universities are never going to sacrifice their brand because that's what they have. They have their selectivity, they have their exclusivity. They're never going to let go of that. They're going to fight tooth and nail to protect that, as I think they should. That's their obligation if they want to be relevant. But I think that Ruth's example also, though, for me, gave a really good example of both the disruption and the transcendence. like her story, the narrative that she threw in there about that grade. Boy, if you think about the power of that story and how nicely it was told and how compelling it was, well, that story carries a lot more weight because it was at Yale that occurred. So to me, that's a really good example of how it's both going to disrupt, but we're not going to shut the university down. And very few people in the badging community are suggesting that. It's really more complementary. And in particular, the other thing that that was mentioned was that someone went off and took a course on something they needed. It was a just-in-time coursework. That's a really different model than anything we've seen before. So to me, it's the synergy between the formal structure and the ability to take these semi-formal opportunities and take advantage of them in the time and place without having to physically move one's body to a classroom or to attend a school. That's the amazing thing that's going to happen, and we're going to see completely new stuff 5 years from now that we practically can't even envision. Again, much of it having to do with the increased importance of digital networks. We're going to see things like the way GitHub is transforming the open source community, the way that Stack Exchange is changing the coding community and the way skills are recognized. That stuff's going to happen everywhere in a lot of different configurations, and it's going to cause a lot of change and some disruption, but no fundamental upheaval. Over.
Okay. George, what do you think? Is it disruptive?
I'm not sure what we mean when we use that term. I think it's necessary. I'm also personally enamored with e-portfolios, both as a record-keeping function over time and personal ownership by the learner. But I think its most formative function is over time, and I think Heather mentioned this, or others as well, the continued development of the critical thinking, analytical reasoning, reflection, integration, transfer, and the recursive notions here of how I'm getting better at not just knowing stuff, but getting better at my own learning. What is somewhat problematic for me right now is how one can use these kinds of record-keeping and formative development pieces and then succinctly summarize for a given audience what these pieces represent. So it's pretty plain now when you talk with employers, they are not interested in transcripts. Transcripts have never really had much meaning, but we've used them as a coda. I must be good at this because I've completed the degree. Well, employers now want to know more about what you say you know and what you say you can do with some demonstrable evidence that you can do it. So for me, all of this deep background is essential for individual learning and personal development, but we have to find ways that we can help then students reduce this, not to sound bites. I'm sounding hypercritical here, but in a 4-minute conversation with an interviewer on a campus or someplace else, to distill these, all of this deep, rich background and say, this is who I am, this is what I can do, and this is what I can do for you.
Other thoughts about this? I'll ask my final question then.
I will say a couple things. One is that increasingly employers are very interested in moving away from massive, 7-page, what they call giant resumes, but I would have called a CV, and they're interested in actually seeing delivery of work product. What have you done in the past 6 months to a year? And so being able to put portfolios of sample code along with you giving a training or talking through the code you wrote and for what purpose is what people are interested in. So we will be launching employer-driven recruitment usage of our portfolio platform for recruitment and talent management moving forward. So I do think that this is an area that is continuing to grow, and I think it is a big opportunity for the instructors, for higher ed institutions to codify and be able to validate the kinds of instruction and experience that can only happen in a university, and build that bridge and engage employers to understand and value what's taking place, not only in the classroom, but when I think about my undergraduate experience at UC Berkeley, I learned as much in my after-school job that I had to have in order to be in college as I did in the classroom, as I did in the student senate, as I did in the student groups. And all of that can be told very nicely with much support and much feedback and guidance in the higher ed experience. And to Daniel's point about the degree, I completely agree. And one of the things that is important to me as a person and as part of my personal mission and the mission of Pathbrite is that we always we are able to provide the best of technology for free from any person from any walk of life. So that, let's say somebody from Richmond, California, who's a high school student whose grades don't look so fantastic because she went to a low-performing public high school, she can really showcase her best attributes when applying to Stanford University or UC Berkeley. And similarly, somebody who went to not a big name brand university could apply and showcase her capabilities when applying for a job at Facebook and look as good as anybody else. And so we hope that we help instill a little bit more meritocracy into the process by offering really good software available to anybody.
Great, and that's interesting since to think about that that assessment and the new way that assessment, certification, and self-assessment could go is that actually could be an agent of this democratic impulse for the whole person. Let me ask a question, give everybody 1 minute to respond. We'll end with George. So here's my question. If you could reinvent the university, if you could start over and reinvent your own university for all the things that we believe universities can be for, all the things that they can do in terms of creating a kind of integrative arc of whole learning, all the things that we associate with universities, but without legacy constraints, thinking about metrics or assessment, the job that universities can do to assess and help people understand what quality work is as well as mediate to the outside world. What's the one most important thing that you would do first to create your ideal reinvented university for the most authentic assessment? What is one thing that you would put in place, that you would want in place for a reinvented university? We're going to take 1 minute. We'll end with George.
Yeah, so I reserve the right to withdraw this statement at some future date, given the grandiose question, Andy. But we have, they've got more experience in Europe than we do. I'd be curious to know how others feel about this offline. But with degree qualifications profiles, and we've been experimenting with one of these, as you know, in the States, Lumina Foundation degree qualifications profile. But that is calibrated to different degree levels. And I'm using the word degree here intentionally. I think what I want from my new reinvented university is a learning qualifications profile, which lays out for me the dispositions, proficiencies that I should have to, if not ensure, at least give me a really good start on 21st century self-sufficiency. Continued lifelong learning. That is, I want my university to give me some structure, but I also want it to be flexible enough to allow me to go where my interests and creativity lead. But I need to be assured that the kind of work I am going to do and produce and will be evaluated by so-called experts and others who can help me will in fact prepare me for this uncertain future. So I want structure, and I want guidance, I want guideposts, and I want to be able to demonstrate that I can actually do this stuff and be held accountable for demonstrating it.
Perfect. Who next? Dan, what do you think?
Okay, I'll go next, shall I?
Okay, great.
Okay. Sorry, a bit of interference here, so I can't figure out what's going on. If I had one thing to do, I'd change the assessment.
I know, do my best.
In a university, and I would keep the transcripts, the normal sort of degree qualification as it is, but add in 2 other assessed outcomes. One would be a learning to learn transcript, which would be based on student narrative data, that the students would be presenting evidence to demonstrate how they've learned how to learn and are going on learning, but it would be essentially from a student perspective. And then the third piece of assessment that I would introduce would be an employability skills transcript that would be based on a 360 observation of students facilitated online, assessing their employability skills like problem solving, working in a team, and so on, and also including some time for all students in the workplace. So I'd change the assessment regime and cause chaos.
Well, chaos is what we're looking for here. Heather and then Dan?
Yeah, well, it's probably not going to sound very surprising what I would do around better assessment. I would mandate a portfolio platform that was campus-wide or system-wide within a university and education system, so that I'm mindful of one of my customers from Stanford University. He said to me, we know a lot more about our students when they come into the university than when they graduate. And I think that that's a real shame. So I would have every freshman coming into university be mandated to use a portfolio, so that all of the instructors, all employers, all counselors, all other people working with those students throughout the time that they're in the university get a real-time insight into what's happening for the student.
Great. Thank you. Dan?
So I just witnessed too many large-scale assessment reforms fail miserably to be confident. Between the time I accepted my postdoc at ETS at the Center for Performance Assessment and the time I got there in the mid-90s, the statewide assessment reforms had collapsed upon themselves in the United States. And I've witnessed several similar large-scale assessment reform efforts at every university I've been at just go absolutely nowhere, including portfolios, the whole range of things. So I'm fairly skeptical about that potential. I think that we need to stop trying to chip away from it. Instead, create an environment where I like that Heather mentioned. So a kid from Richmond, I really care deeply, about underserved individuals, and I worry an awful lot that many of our reforms are simply reifying the challenge of getting education to people who need it the most and who deserve it the most. And so I'm really interested in finding ways to cut costs. I think that this open course movement is tremendously important because it's really cutting the cost almost to zero for fairly high quality instruction. So I think a lot of people who need vocational, who could benefit very directly from very specific vocational training are gaining access to it. I think we need to create lots of pathways to gain access to that stuff, allow innovation to flourish and how that work gets recognized. So let's kind of get out of the way. Let's try to drop some of the institutional barriers to that stuff. Let's let lots of these things flourish, and not try to lock it down too much, and be open to some completely new possibilities. But let's not try to sort of tear down the existing edifice or the existing assessment, or try to make faculty do anything differently than they're doing with assessment, because they're just not going to do it.
I think you brought it home really to the heart of the matter, which is how we can really focus on the student, how we can focus on empowering the broadest number of people. And it really speaks to what I think has been a theme throughout this series, which is trying to imagine what it is that universities can do best, but understanding that universities' near monopoly at doing that has now changed. We're now part of a much larger system, and we have to reimagine what it is our greatest affordances as a university or college environment in the context of this larger system. And I think this conversation has both broadly and very deeply really brought that home, whether it's badging or reimagining what deep learning is, or the role of analytics, or the role of portfolios that exceed formal and informal learning, this new combination of metrics plus context, or the certification plus telling your own stories, that it's really this new remix of these things that we're trying to figure out, and what role the university can play in making that possible for the widest number of people. So thank you all very much for joining us and helping us walk through this really complicated part of the conversation. Very much appreciate all of you. And George, thank you very much for your willingness to be our anchor. And we appreciate everybody who is watching live, and of course we'll be curating the video and sending it out over the internet in multiple forms. So, thanks very much to everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you, Randy.
Thank
Nice
you.
to meet everyone. Hope to see you again soon.
Bye. Thank you. Me too.